They say the house still breathes. Deep in the Louisiana bayou, surrounded by cypress and silence, stands the hollow skeleton of the Duval estate, a once grand sugar plantation now sinking into its own decay. Locals swear the mansion bleeds. Thick, reddish stains seep from its walls like veins pulsing with some memory that refuses to die. Some call it rust. Others say it's blood, the house's way of remembering what happened there a century ago, when the master of the home, a man called Baron Duval, vanished after a night of screams that echoed across the cane fields. Etienne Duval was not born into nobility, but by the time he arrived in Louisiana in 1851, he had learned to live as though he were. In France, he was a merchant's son, ambitious, restless, and obsessed with the idea of legacy. The colonies, he believed, were places where a man could craft his own bloodline from nothing but courage and cunning. So when whispers reached him of fortunes being made along the Mississippi River, where sugar plantations were feeding the wealth of the South, he sold what he owned and sailed across the Atlantic with 2 servants and a chest of family silver. What he found in Louisiana was a world both raw and seductive, a landscape of green swamps, slow-moving rivers, and people who measured a man's worth not by his lineage but by the number of acres he could tame. Duval quickly set his sights on St. James Parish, a fertile stretch of land between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. It was there he bought a decaying estate that had once belonged to a bankrupt cotton grower, and in the marshy fields surrounding it he saw opportunity. To the local gentry, Duval was a curiosity, a Frenchman with refined manners but the ambition of a conqueror. He dined with planters, charmed their wives, and whispered of the grand sugar empires of the Caribbean that he intended to surpass. Within a few short years, he did. He imported machinery from Europe, brought enslaved laborers from nearby auctions, and expanded his property until it was one of the largest sugar operations in the parish. The locals began calling him the Baron, not as a title of respect but of awe and fear. Duval seemed to move through life as if untouched by sweat or consequence. He dressed in immaculate linen even beneath the blistering sun, rode a white horse across the cane fields at dawn, and demanded perfection from those beneath him. Workers spoke of his temper, sudden, cold, and without mercy. He was known to wander the fields at night carrying a lantern, inspecting the rows of cane like a priest examining his congregation. Some said he muttered to himself, reciting numbers or prayers in French as though counting souls. Others claimed he would stop suddenly, stand motionless for minutes at a time, and whisper to the dark. His overseer, a man named Tobias Riley, once told a priest that Duval believed the land could feel pain. It was not superstition, he said, it was pride. Duval's wealth grew monstrous. He hosted extravagant gatherings where Creole families arrived by carriage, and musicians played waltzes beneath chandeliers imported from Paris. Yet beneath the luxury ran a current of unease. His wife, Celeste, was rarely seen and rumored to be ill. A guest once found her sitting in the garden at midnight, staring at the fields and murmuring that she could hear them moving. No one knew what she meant. She died within the year, and the Baron never remarried. With her death, something in Duval darkened. He expanded the mansion, adding wings and towers that made it resemble a French chateau stranded in the swamp. The locals began to call it Maison Rouge, the Red House, though the reason for the name was uncertain. Some said it was because the soil around it bled red after rain. Others believed it referred to what happened behind its shuttered windows. The enslaved workers told stories in whispers, that the Baron had built a hidden chamber beneath the house, that screams could be heard from it when the wind changed direction. By the late 1850s, Duval had become both legend and warning. To outsiders, he was proof that fortune favored the fearless. To those who lived under his shadow, he was something else entirely, a man who had turned the land itself against them, and who would one day pay for it in blood. The mansion that would become known as Maison Rouge began as a statement, a declaration of power carved into the wilderness. Etienne Duval wanted more than comfort. He wanted permanence, something that would outlive him. He chose the highest rise on his plantation, a stretch of earth just firm enough to support the massive structure he envisioned, overlooking the endless green of his cane fields. The year was 1853 when the first foundation stones were laid. He brought in masons from New Orleans, carpenters from France, and enslaved laborers from his own fields to perform the brutal work of raising his empire from the mud. For nearly 3 years, the sound of hammers and saws echoed through the swamps, blending with the drone of insects and the cries of herons. The design was an unsettling marriage between French opulence and southern grandeur. Towering Corinthian columns, wrought iron balconies, and long galleries that caught the humid breeze off the river. The walls were made from a rare mixture of local clay and crushed shell, their surface coated with pale plaster that glowed like bone in the sunlight. To an outsider, it was magnificent. To those who built it, it was a prison taking shape. The enslaved workers slept in shacks along the edge of the property, their labor unending. Duval oversaw every detail himself, pacing the scaffolds, pointing out flaws that no one else could see. He had a painter's obsession with color, insisting that the walls be white, the color of purity, he said, though more than one worker later remarked that when the light hit the plaster just so, it shimmered faintly red. Inside the mansion was a gallery of contradictions. The grand staircase curved like the spine of a beast, its steps carved from imported mahogany. Massive chandeliers hung from ceilings 20 feet high, scattering light across walls lined with portraits, ancestors real and imagined, their painted eyes watching every movement. Duval's office overlooked the fields, with tall French windows and a polished brass telescope always aimed toward the horizon. He kept meticulous ledgers, recording not only his profits but the names, ages, and origins of the enslaved people he owned, as though documenting his possessions were a form of prayer. Visitors spoke of the house with awe. It was said to be the finest private residence in the parish, rivaling even the estates near Baton Rouge. But beneath its grandeur, strange rumors began to circulate. Workers claimed to hear voices in the walls during construction, whispers that rose from the foundation at night. A mason reportedly quit after discovering what he thought was dried blood in the mortar mix. Others swore they saw Duval standing alone in unfinished rooms, running his hand along the wet plaster and murmuring in French, as though blessing it. When the house was completed in 1856, Duval held a grand celebration. Guests arrived in carriages trimmed with gold, greeted by servants in white gloves. They drank imported champagne and danced until dawn, marveling at the mirrored ballroom that reflected every flicker of candlelight 100-fold. It was a spectacle meant to impress, but to the locals who passed by the estate from the road, the mansion seemed otherworldly, too perfect, too still, like a portrait that might come to life if one stared too long. Duval claimed he had built the house as a tribute to civilization, a European jewel in the heart of the American wilderness. Yet others whispered that he had built it as a fortress, a monument to his own guilt. Some believed he had incorporated symbols into the masonry, strange sigils traced beneath the plaster, charms from the old country meant to protect the owner from restless spirits. Others said the land itself rejected what he had built upon it. During the first heavy rains, water seeped through the cracks in the foundation, staining the cellar walls with streaks of reddish mud. Duval ordered them repainted at once, furious at the imperfection, but the stains always returned. Workers began to call the marks les larmes de la terre, the tears of the earth. To most, it was merely the cost of grandeur in the Louisiana swamps. The damp, the rust, the decay that came for every structure sooner or later. But those who had seen the stains firsthand said they looked too much like blood to be dismissed so easily. And even before the first guests left that night, there were murmurs that Maison Rouge was not a house blessed by fortune, but cursed by the very ground it stood upon. By the time the mansion was complete, Baron Etienne Duval had become one of the most powerful men in southern Louisiana, and one of the most feared. His fortune swelled with each season's harvest, but so did the stories whispered about what it cost to maintain it. Workers began to vanish from the plantation without explanation. At first, Duval blamed swamp fevers, alligators, or desertion, but the numbers were too many, the disappearances too clean. No bodies were found, no belongings left behind, just names erased from the ledgers and hastily scratched out by Duval's quill, as though they had never existed. The enslaved people who remained spoke in hushed tones after dark, huddled near the sugar mill's furnaces. They said that those who went missing had been taken to the basement of the mansion, a place no one ever entered willingly. Some claimed Duval had constructed a hidden chamber below the foundation, accessible only through a locked door near the wine cellar. The sound of chains was sometimes heard beneath the floorboards, even when the house stood silent. One woman swore she had seen Duval himself hauling a heavy sack down the stairs one moonless night. And when she reported it to the overseer, she was whipped and sent away to work the farthest edge of the property. Visitors noticed something strange in Duval's demeanor during those years. The once flamboyant host had grown withdrawn, his temper brittle, his smile calculated. He avoided the company of other planters, preferring to dine alone in his vast dining hall. When guests did arrive, they often remarked on the chill in the air, not from temperature but from something unseen. Servants said he rarely slept, pacing the corridors at night, whispering in French. One maid recalled seeing him pause before a mirror in the hallway and whisper, "You will obey." When she told others, she was dismissed the next morning without pay. Tobias Riley, the Irish overseer who had managed the fields for nearly a decade, once confronted Duval about the missing workers. According to local legend, the conversation turned violent. Riley was last seen leaving the mansion with a bloodied shirt and an expression of pure terror. The next day, his cabin was empty, his belongings gone. Duval told the others that Riley had fled north to avoid his debts. No one believed him. As the years passed, the atmosphere of the plantation grew oppressive. The cane stalks seemed to wither faster near the house. Tools went missing, crops failed without reason, and the air carried a strange metallic scent that clung to the hands of those who worked the mill. One elderly laborer told a priest that the soil itself had gone tired of drinking. The priest visited once in 1860 to bless the grounds. He left before sunset and never returned. By this time, Duval's cruelty was no longer confined to whispers. His punishments became spectacles. Beatings conducted at dawn, carried out in front of others as warnings. He spoke of obedience, of the order of nature, of his divine right to command both the living and the land. But beneath that arrogance was something else, fear. Those who observed him closely said the Baron had begun to look over his shoulder too often, as though expecting someone, or something, to be standing there. The house itself began to betray signs of unease. Cracks formed in the plaster along the stairwell. Red stains, faint and irregular, appeared on the lower walls of the east wing. Servants tried to scrub them away, but they returned within days, seeping through the paint like veins. Duval claimed it was a plumbing issue, though the house had no metal pipes. When the first of the overseer's children fell ill, a boy of 8 who played near the house and was found feverish and raving about the man in the red room, the local doctor refused to step foot on the property again. The boy died within the week, and the family moved away without collecting their pay. From then on, no one in St. James Parish would work within the mansion walls after dusk. By 1861, when the Civil War drew close and the world outside was burning, the Duval estate had already begun its quiet descent into madness. The sugar still flowed, the profit still grew, but the human cost was invisible, absorbed by the house itself. And those who survived long enough to leave would tell the same story years later, that the Baron's cruelty didn't just destroy the people who served him. It soaked into the bricks, the floors, and the very air, waiting for the day it would all come bleeding back out. The night of Baron Etienne Duval's disappearance began like a celebration and ended like a haunting. It was early spring of 1862, and though the war had begun to tear through the South, Duval refused to acknowledge it. His field still thrived, his fortune remained untouched, and his pride, perhaps the only thing stronger than his wealth, would not allow him to show fear. He announced a masquerade ball at Maison Rouge, inviting what remained of the parish's elite to dine and dance beneath his glittering chandeliers. Some thought it madness to host such a spectacle when Union troops were drawing near, but Duval called it an act of defiance against decay. Carriages rolled in through the oak-lined drive that evening, their wheels cracking against gravel damp with mist. The mansion blazed with candlelight, music echoing through its halls. Guests wore jeweled masks and gowns stitched from imported silk, their laughter echoing across the verandas like a defiant chorus. But beneath the laughter was unease. The house seemed too bright, the air too still, as if the land itself held its breath. Duval appeared near midnight, dressed in crimson and gold, a half-mask covering his face. He toasted to immortality, to empire, to the power of men who shaped the world with their will. The guests applauded, but one woman later said his eyes were wild, his hands trembling as he raised the glass. The celebration continued until well past midnight. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, the music faltered. A servant had gone to fetch wine from the cellar and did not return. Another followed, and then a third. Whispers spread that something was wrong below. Duval left the ballroom and descended the grand staircase alone, brushing off his guests' concerns with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Moments later, a scream echoed through the hall, sharp, brief, and followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy striking the floor. Then came silence. No one dared follow him at first. The guests stood frozen, their masks reflecting the flickering candlelight. Eventually, Tobias Riley's replacement, a young overseer named Samuel Grant, gathered the courage to open the door to the study. The room was empty, save for the scent of iron and the sight of dark stains creeping down the wallpaper near the fireplace. The floorboards glistened as though something wet had soaked through from beneath. A gold cufflink shaped like a serpent lay in the corner, rusted at its edge though it was made of pure gold. The search began at dawn. Servants scoured the mansion, the cellars, and the fields, but Duval had vanished. His clothes, his horse, his ledger, all remained untouched. Some of the guests fled before sunrise, unwilling to be questioned or connected to whatever had occurred. Others stayed, convinced he would reappear. But as the day wore on, the heat thickened and a smell began to rise from the floors. Faint at first, then undeniable. It was the odor of rust or blood, depending on who you asked. Within days, strange things began to happen. The walls of the study, as freshly cleaned, began to stain again, thin red lines running down in irregular trails. Workers tried to repaint, but the color seeped through, darker each time. The servants who remained swore they could hear faint tapping from inside the walls at night, as though someone were knocking from within. One claimed to have seen muddy footprints leading up from the cellar stairs that ended abruptly at the study door. Another said she saw Duval's reflection in a mirror, not as he had been, but older, pale, and dripping with water. By the end of that week, no one remained in the house. The fields lay unworked, the machinery silent. Neighbors who passed by at night claimed to see candlelight flickering in the upper windows, and to hear faint music playing, as if the masquerade had never ended. When the sheriff finally arrived, he found the mansion unlocked and empty, its walls streaked with a dark, crusted residue that smelled faintly metallic. The stains would not come off. They would spread year by year as though the house itself had taken the Baron's place, his final grotesque inheritance. By the turn of the century, Maison Rouge had become less a home and more a whispered warning. After Duval's disappearance, the property passed through a tangle of legal disputes, its ownership as cursed as its walls. For decades it stood empty, slowly surrendering to the Louisiana heat, until in 1903, a wealthy New Orleans merchant named Charles Lefebvre purchased it at auction. Lefebvre was a man of logic and ambition, a financier who believed no mystery could withstand reason. He planned to restore the mansion, to erase the superstitions that had clung to it for nearly half a century, and to turn the estate into a summer retreat for his family. But from the moment he arrived, things began to resist him. The first thing he noticed was the smell. The air inside the house was thick, metallic. Not rot exactly, but something sour that clung to the throat. Workers he hired to clean the place complained of headaches and nausea, claiming the scent worsened the deeper they went. One man refused to return after finding reddish stains streaking through the plaster beneath a layer of white paint. Lefebvre dismissed their fears, attributing it to rust, humidity, or some remnant of age. He ordered the walls sanded and repainted in bright ivory to invite light back into the home. But within days, the stains returned, bleeding through the fresh paint in slow, irregular lines that no brush could conceal. Lefebvre's wife, Madeleine, was the first to sense something deeper. She wrote in a letter to her sister that she heard footsteps in the hallways late at night, deliberate, dragging, as if someone were pacing the length of the corridor. The maids refused to sleep inside after one claimed to see a figure standing at the top of the staircase, a man dressed in a coat the color of dried blood. Lefebvre, frustrated and embarrassed, replaced the entire staff and insisted his family remain in the city while he completed the restoration himself. "There is no ghost here," he wrote in his journal. "Only decay, and decay can be conquered." For a while it seemed he might be right. The mansion's structure was repaired, the gardens cleared, and the rooms furnished with European antiques. But as the summer heat thickened, the stains grew worse. They began in the corners, then spread upward like veins. The iron chandeliers corroded overnight, and the mirrors in the ballroom developed a strange fog that could not be wiped away. When Lefebvre brought in engineers to test for contamination in the walls, they found traces of iron oxide and sulfur, the compounds that form when blood breaks down in the air. The more he tried to control the house, the more it seemed to rebel. Doors swelled shut, locks rusted solid, and the foundation itself began to groan during storms as though something below were shifting in the earth. Lefebvre started hearing things. Faint knocks from the cellar, the echo of footsteps behind him when no one was there. His workers began quitting one by one, muttering that the house remembers. Only his foreman remained, a practical man named Jules, who one night found his employer standing barefoot in the study, tracing the wall with his hand as if following the path of the stains. "It's alive," Lefebvre whispered. "It breathes through the cracks." By the end of that summer, the Lefebvre abandoned the mansion. They left behind their furniture, their tools, and even the ledgers that recorded the restoration expenses. The locals said they fled after Madeleine woke screaming in the night, claiming she had seen a face pressed against the wall beside her bed, the skin gray and weeping rust. When authorities came weeks later, they found the mansion empty but for a half-finished glass of wine on the dining table and a trail of red streaks leading up the grand staircase. The stains had spread across nearly every room now. Not splattered, not random, but deliberate, like something drawn by a hand that wanted to be remembered. In the years that followed the Lefebvre's flight, Maison Rouge became a place of fascination for scientists, journalists, and skeptics, each determined to expose the mystery as mere legend. In 1924, a team of chemists from Tulane University arrived to collect samples of the strange red stains that wept through the mansion's plaster. They were confident they'd find an ordinary explanation, oxidation perhaps, or mineral leaching from the brick beneath. The first samples they took seemed to confirm this theory, traces of iron, calcium, and sulfur consistent with rust. But when they returned the following morning, the streaks had reappeared in entirely new places, flowing downward in irregular trails as though the walls themselves had exhaled something overnight. The lead researcher, Dr. Arthur Bellamy, described the phenomenon in his notes with careful restraint, though it was clear his composure was shaken. "There is an active process at work," he wrote, "though no biological agent we can identify. The seepage appears fresh, damp to the touch, yet we cannot trace a source within the structure. It is as though the moisture condenses from within the wall itself." He conducted further experiments, sealing sections of plaster under glass, but the stains continued to form, bleeding through solid barriers that should have prevented any reaction. When Bellamy's assistant, a young man named Harlan Cook, suffered a sudden seizure after handling one of the samples, the experiment was abruptly halted. Locals claimed the team left without finishing their research, abandoning their equipment after one of their instruments shattered during the night. Bellamy never published his findings, though in later interviews he would admit to an inexplicable sense of dread while inside the mansion. He described the silence as oppressive, like being trapped inside a lung that had forgotten how to breathe. Over the decades, others came to study the site, journalists from New Orleans, amateur historians, even paranormal investigators before the term existed. Each left with their own version of the story, but none could fully dismiss what they saw. In 1947, a photographer documenting abandoned southern estates reported that his film came out distorted when he shot inside Maison Rouge. The negatives were fogged with a reddish haze, as if light had bent unnaturally within the house. He returned a week later with new equipment, and found the stains had shifted positions since his last visit. The trail seemed to climb the walls in thin, branching lines, like veins forming through stone. By the mid-20th century, the state considered condemning the property, but surveyors refused to enter. They reported soft ground beneath the foundation, suggesting the mansion was sinking, though others argued the structure was sound. The truth was that no one wanted to touch it. Those who did, the few brave or foolish enough, spoke of a feeling of heaviness that clung to them afterward, a smell of iron that lingered on their clothes. In the 1960s, the final documented study took place, led by a geologist named Martha Kent. She believed the stains were caused by natural chemical reactions between the groundwater and the old building materials. Her tests were methodical, her tone skeptical, until the night she stayed alone to monitor temperature changes. In her notes, later recovered from her abandoned tent outside, she wrote of hearing soft knocking within the walls, followed by what she described as a low exhalation, like breath drawn through plaster. She left before sunrise, refusing to ever return. Her samples, locked away in university storage, were later found to contain no unusual compounds. Yet they emitted a faint metallic odor for decades after. The scientific world eventually lost interest, dismissing the mansion as an unsolved curiosity, a relic of superstition rather than science. But for those who lived nearby, the legend never faded. Hunters swore they saw the windows glowing faintly at night. Children dared each other to touch the red walls and claimed they could feel them pulse faintly under their palms. And every few years, someone new would come to investigate, only to leave shaken, whispering the same phrase the old workers once did, that the house was not corroding, not rusting, but remembering. By the present day, Maison Rouge stands half swallowed by the Louisiana bayou, its once proud columns strangled by vines, its roof collapsing inward like a body long gone soft with decay. The air around it feels heavier than the rest of the swamp, as though sound itself hesitates to enter. The locals no longer speak its name aloud. They call it simply the Bleeding House. From the road it looks like any other ruin, but up close, it breathes a different kind of silence. The plaster walls, cracked and sunken, still carry the streaks that have baffled every generation since the Baron vanished. They darken in the rain, glisten in the humidity, and dry into thin, rust-colored veins that shimmer faintly when the moonlight hits them. Most who wander near do so by accident. Hunters claim their dogs refuse to approach, howling and backing away when the house comes into view. Teenagers from nearby parishes sometimes dare each other to enter, usually on moonless nights, but few make it past the front door. The air inside is thick, humid, and smells faintly metallic like a storm that never ends. The wooden floors groan underfoot and water drips from somewhere unseen, though the roof above is long gone. Those who've gone deeper describe a presence that seems to shift from room to room, a pressure in the chest, a sense of being watched by something too patient to move. In recent decades, the state has fenced off the property, citing safety concerns. Still, that hasn't stopped the curious. Documentarians, paranormal researchers, and local historians have all tried to capture what remains of Maison Rouge before it collapses entirely. One such visitor, a photographer named Elise Morel, spent 3 nights there in 1998. She described hearing faint music coming from the ballroom, though the wind was still. When she developed her photos, she found that in several frames, faint shapes appeared near the staircase. Shadowy figures, blurred, almost human, clustered where the old stains bled through the wall. In one photo, a single handprint was visible in the center of the frame, long thin fingers, as though pressed against the lens from the other side. In 2007, an architectural survey team entered the house for structural assessment. The report they submitted remains one of the most chilling pieces of bureaucratic writing ever filed. They noted that the inner plaster surfaces exhibit recurring seepage consistent with iron oxide discharge, but also that the stains appear to expand in patterns that suggest organic origin. One member of the team, interviewed anonymously years later, claimed that during their inspection, he saw a drip forming on the wall that moved upward, defying gravity before disappearing into the ceiling. When he reached out to touch the spot, the wall felt warm, and for a brief moment seemed to pulse under his hand. The surrounding land has reclaimed most of the estate now. Cypress roots twist through the old brick foundation, snakes nest in the stairwell, and moss hangs from the balconies like rotted lace. Yet even as nature devours it, the mansion refuses to die quietly. Every few years the walls will erupt again in new streaks, deep reddish-brown trails that ooze fresh and dark before drying. Some say it happens after storms, when lightning strikes nearby and the air smells of ozone and blood. Others believe it responds to human presence, that the house wakes when it is watched. At sunset, the place glows faintly red, as if remembering its name. Locals passing on the river road sometimes mistake it for fire, but when they approach, there's only silence and the faint scent of rust. No one has lived there for over a century, yet people still report seeing a lantern moving along the veranda, a figure in a crimson coat standing in the doorway, or the sound of boots pacing the upper hall. Whether it's memory, madness, or something that has outlived both man and time, no one can say. But in Louisiana's damp heart, where history and myth rot together, the Duval mansion still bleeds, not from rust or water or age, but from the weight of what it remembers and refuses to let fade. What if some places never stop keeping score? What if the walls of Maison Rouge aren't rusted, but remembering? The stains, the silence, the way the air still feels heavy with something unspoken. These aren't just remnants of time. They're echoes of guilt, of violence, of lives that refuse to fade quietly into history. As you leave this story behind tonight, ask yourself, can a house truly forget what was done inside it? Or do the walls themselves become witnesses bleeding until they're heard? If stories like this still haunt you long after they end, you belong here with us. Subscribe to uncover more forgotten crimes, lost estates, and histories that refuse to stay buried. Tell us in the comments, what do you believe still lingers inside Maison Rouge? A trick of the earth? Or something waiting for someone to listen? Every week we unearth another secret history. Places abandoned but not empty. Stories silenced but not gone. Stay curious. Stay unsettled. Because sometimes the past doesn't die. It only changes its shape.